being a Black kid in a predominantly white elementary school radicalized me from an early age. Like, I went through a goth phase, but like not like a regular goth. I'm gonna be a Black Panther at 11 when I grow up, to the point where I'm like, one of the first stencils I made was like, oh, I'm gonna cut out this stencil of Huey P. Newton and like spray paint it on my wall and like do all this other stuff to just drive my parents insane. I think the first instance of printmaking that I saw was actually, do you remember Shepherd Ferry, Obey? Yeah, Obey was really big in like 2010 to like 2014, so very impressionable. I think I would have been between like 12 and 14 then. And I would like rewatch this Obey documentary over and over and over again. And also like all these like graffiti writer and screen printing documentaries or wheat paster documentaries. I was like, that's where it's at. Like I was obsessed. Like that's where the Huey P. Newton stencil came from. Like I went on YouTube and learned how to make stencils that day out of like a binder, an old binder that I had used for school. Once the pandemic happened, I had taken a long sabbatical from art. And when I came back, I was still interested in like the ways that structures could tell the story of people over time. But I had been reading more and more about queerness because while it had always been a sensibility and a point of my work, I think I wanted it to become more prominent just because of the books I was reading and of the person I was becoming. I see a lot of this documented in dance, in drag, in music, and all these other ways, but I don't really see the Black queer perspective in visual arts as much. Of course, now I've made more friends and seen more, but I still think that it's important to like kind of have that stake and have that record of us here.
People approach being an artist different kinds of ways, and seeing the way that Kiara approaches it has like taught me a lot, honestly. Just like, you know, the long nights in the studio, or like they're trying to put together a critique group because they genuinely care about like, you know, people being able to like share art in that way.
I am interested in seeing how my work engages with the world. I think a lot of the topics that I pull from have been dealing with history. So I kind of am very interested in the politics of past and how it's constantly affecting our present. I think that's one thing about being like a young Black person taught me, is that like I am the product of so much strife. And then as I got older and coming to terms with my queerness, understanding that like, oh, I didn't have to feel alone at that point. The reason why I felt alone and like I didn't know that there were other people like me, or like that I had this whole rich history, or that I wasn't strange, was like it's a concerted effort by like the people who write history and the people who decide what history gets passed on.
We both like value queer history a lot, and like feel like I listen to this podcast or about queer history or whatever, and I think there's a reverence there. I think there's a callback to like people before us, queer people before us. When we think about queer people before us, they couldn't show up in the world the way that they wanted to show up. I feel like when we make art that encompasses, that part of our identity, like it's bigger than us.
Now the first one is called a test rig.
My artist statement, I would say that I use print media to create layered, lush narratives that transcend time and space to connect Black queer people with our ancestry and highlight the similarities of us throughout time. I could make art that is strictly about materiality, but I think that would neglect so much of the scope of what it means to have a material. To hold wood in my hands, I know that wood was chopped down from somewhere. I have to think about, what does it mean to ethically source wood? What does it mean to live in this country while I'm making things with wood? What does it mean to be an artist when so much has gone into me like being financially successful? What does it mean to be a person where I'm at, whether that's politically, whether that's in terms of like gender or sexuality or financial status? All of these things converging are happening while I'm making art. So I could make a very narrow scope and just make art that was dealing with the pigment and how it interacts with the wood grain, right? But there's so much story that happens before that pigment gets ground up, tossed in oil and sent to me, or like before that wood gets processed in my hands. I think it would be neglectful to just have such a narrow kind of view when making work. I will say this orange one's already starting to turn green a little bit more in like the natural light, so that's a good sign. If I'm about to start like a new big piece or a new body of work, I'm a little bit voracious with the amount of stuff I'm consuming to make sure that I have like a well to draw from. I don't make a drawing first. Usually what happens is I'll have a sentence or like a fragment, a phrase fragment, and I'll be like, okay, that feels delicious, right? That's something that I want to keep engaging with. And after that, I'll think of what could be the visual representation of this sentence or this feeling? Or what is the question that I want to pose to the audience? Some ideas are better suited for certain mediums. And I think my favorite is whatever the best iteration of my idea is, right? So like if I've made 3 pieces that are in this vein and then the 4th one is like, oh, I finally am doing it right. And sometimes I have to jump around. Sometimes I have an idea in woodcut and I'm like, and then I'm like, maybe a silkscreen, nah. And then I have to like maybe look something up that's new.
This is not like official.
As a friend, I feel like Kiara is the kind of person that if you're in a tough spot or, you know, they'll make that offer to be like, I can be there for you in that. And I think if something ever happens with them, like, where do you need me to be? How can I help? And I think as we build our relationships and our friendships, as adults, I feel like Kiara's kind of way of moving through the world, you know, impacts the people that are around them.
It's been interesting more recently because I am starting to think more, okay, what would happen if I put this in front of an audience? What would they think? Not in terms of like letting it define me. I don't want to be hindered by the audience, but I'm interested to work on trusting the audience, which I think is a big thing for me. Because as a person who's like making capital B, capital Q, Black queer work, right? I don't want to be didactic or educational, really. I want to be, if anything, a little bit more disruptive, or something that feels like energetically realistic to where I want to be met at. I don't want to be simplifying it too much for the audience. The idea of being able to disseminate information quickly and cheaply was very like gratifying to me, even as a little kid, because I'm like reading the comic books, it's like someone has worked hours making this artwork and I'm enjoying it, and so are like thousands of other people, and we all have a community around that. And it just didn't feel like there would be that same community if I made one work that you could only see one time. Kind of being able to democratize it a little bit so that it can be in more hands and people can have more personal individual experiences with the work, as opposed to only being able to see it in one location. And I know that there's like a certain beauty to that. I think if it was like a concert or a performance, that's one thing, but like the intimacy of being able to hold an art object was really important to me as a kid, like whether it was watching cartoons or reading comic books or making my little stencils. So I wanted to continue that out in the world, but with like a fine art image. Yes, there's a lot of danger in the world, but there's also a lot of beauty. So having the breadth of both, and that's why I don't like making work that's like all beauty, or I like my work to have a darker side, because I grew up like watching the news, and it's like, yeah, the lighting is so bright, but they're saying the darkest things to you. And I think that sort of dichotomy is really beautiful and hard to grapple with, and that's what I want my work to be.